In the nascent stages of 1942, the initial American aviators who engaged in aerial combat with Japanese Zero fighters over the vast expanse of the Pacific returned with accounts that bordered on the fantastical, yet were imbued with a grim reality. They vividly described an enemy interceptor capable of executing turns tighter than any aircraft the United States Navy or Army Air Forces could deploy. The Mitsubishi A6M0, far from being merely adept, proved to be terrifyingly proficient, and its formidable capabilities were exacting a heavy toll on American pilots. On February 20, 1942, during the inaugural Japanese aerial assault on Darwin, Australia, a formation of 9 Zeros, tasked with escorting bombers, encountered a hastily deployed contingent of P-40 Warhawks. The resulting skirmish was remarkably brief, lasting only minutes. The Zeros successfully downed 4 P-40s without sustaining any losses themselves. The American pilots who managed to survive consistently reported the same disheartening pattern. Whenever they attempted to match a Zero's turn to bring their guns to bear, the Japanese fighter would effortlessly maneuver within their turning arc, slipping inside their radius and securing a dominant position directly behind them. It was akin to endeavoring to outmaneuver a graceful adversary while severely encumbered, like trying to outdance a ballerina while wearing lead boots. The statistical data emerging from those early months was stark. Across the Philippines, over Wake Island, and throughout the Dutch East Indies, American fighter pilots confronted an unforgiving numerical disparity. The Zero possessed the remarkable ability to execute a complete 360-degree turn in approximately 16 seconds at combat speeds. In contrast, the F-4F Wildcat, America's foremost naval fighter aircraft, required about 19 seconds for the same maneuver, and the P-40 Warhawk needed even longer. While a mere 3-second difference might seem negligible, in the intense context of a turning dogfight, those crucial seconds meant the Zero could complete its turn, acquire a precise firing solution, and unleash 20mm cannon rounds through an adversary's cockpit, while the American pilot was still strenuously maneuvering his own machine, trying to point his nose at an empty patch of sky. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Yet raw numbers only illuminate a fraction of the narrative. The Zero attained its extraordinary turning prowess through an unconventional engineering doctrine. Japanese designers crafted an aircraft that weighed a mere 5,300 lb empty, equating to roughly 2/3 the mass of an F-4F Wildcat. They achieved this significant weight reduction by systematically eliminating almost all armor protection for the pilot and fuel tanks. This meant the absence of self-sealing fuel tanks and only minimal armored plating behind the pilot's seat. Essentially, the Zero was a powerful engine encased in a fragile casing, deliberately prioritizing agility above all else, at the expense of defensive resilience. American pilots were not yet privy to these design specifics, but they certainly experienced the dire repercussions. Every engagement unfolded according to a consistent sequence of events. American aviators would visually acquire Zeros, initiate a diving attack, perhaps discharge a brief volley of gunfire, and then the Zeros would promptly turn to engage. The moment an American pilot attempted to engage in a horizontal turning engagement to maintain pursuit of the enemy, he had already lost. The Zero would simply outturn him, smoothly transitioning from defender to attacker in a matter of seconds. Experienced pilots often developed a profound sense of dread in their stomachs, as they applied aggressive control inputs, acutely aware they were entering an engagement inherently stacked against them. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley articulated the gravity of the predicament in March 1942, following engagements near Guadalcanal. It's not that our boys lack courage or skill. They have both in abundance, but they're trying to fight by the rules, and the rules don't work anymore. We're teaching them to dogfight, to turn and burn, to stay in the fight against Zeros. That's teaching them to die. His poignant words penetrated to the core of the existential threat facing American naval aviation. The established principles of aerial engagement, meticulously developed over years of training and theoretical study, had been rendered obsolete within a shockingly brief period of weeks. The crisis transcended the immediate concern of individual pilot survival. Dominance of the skies in the Pacific theater hinged on prevailing in these fighter versus fighter engagements. If American fighters proved incapable of protecting dive bombers and torpedo planes, then carrier task forces would be unable to successfully prosecute attacks against Japanese targets. If fighters could not safeguard bases and bomber formations, America's ability to project power vanished. The Zero problem was not merely a matter of dogfighting. It jeopardized the overarching military strategy across the entire Pacific theater. Pilots began to refer to this chilling realization as Zero Fever. It was the moment of cold epiphany in a turning fight with a Japanese fighter, when one understood that the adversary would execute his maneuver with superior swiftness. Some pilots became paralyzed by indecision. Others resorted to frantic evasive actions that only exacerbated their peril. However, a select few began adopting an unconventional approach, and these individuals started to discern a peculiar characteristic about the Zero's behavior. Commander John Smith Thatch, universally known as Jimmy, grappled with a pressing dilemma that preoccupied his thoughts aboard the USS Lexington in early 1942. As the commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3, he bore the profound responsibility of preserving the lives of his pilots, while they confronted an enemy aircraft that demonstrated overwhelming superiority over their F-4F Wildcats across nearly all performance metrics. Thatch was a distinctive figure within the naval command of his era. He possessed an intellectual curiosity beyond mere flight operations he studied. While other squadron commanders primarily focused on gunnery practice and formation flying, Thatch dedicated countless hours to meticulously analyzing after-action reports, debriefing airmen upon their return, and diligently performing computations on rudimentary notes. By April 1942, Thatch had amassed sufficient intelligence to discern the recurring dynamic with clarity. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros consistently shared common experiences. They described how the Zero pilot would fixate upon an adversary and follow through a turning engagement with almost uncanny accuracy. The Japanese pilot, secure in the knowledge that his aircraft could outturn anything American, would dedicate himself entirely to the maneuver, constricting his turning arc and enduring increased gravitational loads, confident that his intended victim would reach its maneuverability limits sooner. This unwavering confidence became predictable, and predictability, Thatch realized, presented an opportunity for tactical advantage. Thatch observed something else in the debriefings that most officers attributed to psychological strain or unreliable memory. Multiple pilots reported that when they had attempted unorthodox aerial movements, sudden dives, unexpected climbs, or aggressive throttle reductions, Zero pilots sometimes appeared momentarily disoriented. The Japanese flyers had become habituated to American airmen engaging according to established conventions, maintaining speed, attempting to turn, and eventually succumbing. Anything that departed from this expected sequence of actions seemed to briefly confuse the adversary. These were fleeting instances, usually not enough to preserve the pilot's life, but they were significant observations nonetheless. The pivotal insight emerged when Thatch interviewed Lieutenant Edward "Butch" O'Hare following his remarkable display of aerial prowess on February 20, 1942. O'Hare had unilaterally protected the Lexington against 9 Japanese bombers, successfully shooting down 5. However, Thatch's primary focus was not on the bomber interception. It was on how O'Hare had engaged the accompanying Zero fighters. O'Hare described executing rapid, decisive passes, firing, and then deliberately avoiding horizontal turning engagements. Instead, he utilized his Wildcat's greater velocity in a dive to break away, rapidly ascending to a higher elevation, converting kinetic energy into potential energy, and attacking again. He consistently avoided being drawn into a protracted turning battle by a Zero. Thatch commenced conducting rudimentary simulations with desk implements, pushing 2 matchsticks around to model various combat strategies. The fundamental challenge lay in individual vulnerability. If a Zero secured a position directly behind one's aircraft, and one could not outturn it, survival was unlikely. But what if one was not alone? What if a flight partner could serve as an offensive asset? He moved the matchsticks in intersecting trajectories, creating situations where a Zero pursuing one Wildcat would unavoidably enter the firing solution of a second aircraft. The mathematical principle was straightforward, but it demanded impeccable synchronization and unwavering confidence between pilots. On May 10, 1942, Thatch assembled his flight personnel in the Lexington's ready room and unveiled his innovative tactical scheme. He referred to it as the beam defense position, though it would forever be known as the Thatch weave. The concept was groundbreaking. Instead of fighting individually, 2 Wildcats would maintain equidistant flight paths, approximately 200 ft apart. When a Zero attacked one plane, both Wildcats would turn toward each other in a crisscross pattern. The Zero, dedicated to tracking the first Wildcat through the turn, would abruptly discover the second Wildcat crossing directly in front of him, weapons discharging. If the Zero disengaged to evade incoming fire, the first Wildcat was safe. If the Zero continued pursuing, it would fly straight into a barrage of .50 caliber bullets. However, Thatch was uncovering a deeper insight than just the weave. He was documenting something more fundamental about Zero tactics. Japanese pilots, he noted, had developed predictable behaviors stemming from their aircraft's inherent advantages. They anticipated American airmen would engage according to established conventions, to turn, to try to dogfight, to play by rules that favored the Zero. This expectation resulted in a narrow, tactical focus. Zero pilots would engage in chases with such unwavering self-assurance that they would disregard indicators of peril. They would follow American fighters into situations that a more cautious pilot would identify as hazardous ambushes. Thatch disseminated his findings with every squadron commander who would listen. He authored comprehensive strategic advisories that were distributed throughout the naval forces. Some of his ideas were disregarded. Senior officers who had never faced a Zero thought Thatch was unnecessarily elaborating on straightforward aerial combat principles. But the pilots who had survived combat in the South Pacific devoured Thatch's analyses with profound earnestness. Here was someone who comprehended the precise nature of their adversary and who was developing methodical approaches to overcome challenges rather than merely advocating for increased bravery or improved marksmanship. The true crucible for aerial combat innovation was destined to be the Battle of Midway. The revolutionary Thatch weave, when initially presented, appeared utterly illogical and counter to established wisdom. For decades, since the First World War, naval aviation doctrine had rigorously emphasized maintaining tight formation integrity, providing mutual defense through circular maneuvers and honing individual pilot prowess in dogfights. Yet Thatch was now instructing his aviators to perform the seemingly suicidal act of deliberately turning their aircraft directly towards an approaching enemy, to intersect their wingmen's flight paths at dizzying speeds, and to place their faith in precise geometric calculations and impeccable timing for survival, rather than relying on their aircraft's turning capabilities. This radical departure challenged and indeed violated every deeply ingrained instinct that fighter pilots had meticulously cultivated through years of rigorous training. During the arduous voyage to Midway, in late May 1942, Thatch subjected his pilots to an unrelenting regimen of drills. 2 Wildcats would repeatedly launch into the sky, practicing the intricate scissoring motion over and over, banking sharply towards each other, executing a high-speed pass, then immediately reversing course to pass again. This continuous choreographed dance in the air created a complex interwoven defensive zone that was almost impervious to a single attacking aircraft. However, the maneuver demanded nothing short of absolute precision. A timing error of even a single second could result in a catastrophic mid-air collision between the 2 Wildcats. Any hesitation or misjudgment of the critical crossing point by one pilot would cause the entire defensive structure to unravel, leaving both aircraft dangerously exposed and vulnerable. Thatch, as pilots persevered, practicing until the maneuver became a reflex, an instinctive response they could execute flawlessly, even under the intense duress of actual combat, with adrenaline surging and hands trembling. On June 4, 1942, the pivotal Battle of Midway unfolded, providing the ultimate proving ground for this daring new tactic. Leading his division of 6 Wildcats, Thatch served as an escort for the American torpedo bombers, which were bravely pressing their attack against the formidable Japanese carrier fleet. At precisely Irwine time 20 hours, a swarm of Japanese Zeros descended upon the formation, a sight that mirrored Thatch's gravest apprehensions, more than a dozen Zeros diving aggressively on his numerically inferior Wildcats. Without a moment's hesitation, Thatch initiated the weave with his wingman, Ensign Robert Ramdib. A Zero, exhibiting characteristic Japanese aggression and confidence, latched onto Thatch's tail and pursued him into the turn. Time 2s. The Japanese pilot's actions unfolded precisely as Thatch had theorized, demonstrating a complete commitment to the chase, an unwavering belief in his aircraft's superior turning agility, and an exclusive focus on the target directly ahead. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this insightful video. We would be incredibly grateful for your like and subscription. Please also consider leaving a comment below about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. In a breathtaking flash, Dib's Wildcat crossed directly in front of Thatch's aircraft at a combined closing speed approaching 500 mph. The pursuing Zero pilot, caught entirely by surprise, suddenly found his aircraft hurtling directly into the deadly maw of Dib's gun sight with a mere 2 seconds or less to react. Dib's fusillade of 650 caliber machine guns tore through the Zero's unarmored airframe with devastating effect, causing the aircraft to disintegrate in midair. Thach, with remarkable agility, immediately reversed his turn, weaving back across Dib's flight path. Another Zero, which had been relentlessly pursuing Dib, now found itself confronting the identical, unsolvable geometric quandary. Thatch's guns were now aimed directly at this second adversary. The Zero pilot, recognizing the suicidal nature of pressing the attack, abruptly broke off, unwilling to fly into certain death. In a stunning display of tactical brilliance, lasting less than 30 seconds, the Thatch Weave had not only annihilated one Zero, but had also compelled another to disengage from the fight. The intense engagement persisted for nearly 20 minutes. Thatch's division maintained their relentless weaving, their continuous crossing patterns, consistently turning towards each other rather than attempting to evade independently. The Zeros, whose pilots were accustomed to effortlessly picking off isolated American fighters, proved utterly incapable of penetrating this dynamic, interwoven defensive barrier. Each time a Zero committed to an attack, it inevitably flew into a lethal crossfire. Japanese pilots, who had grown comfortable with the predictable combat behavior of their American counterparts, were suddenly confronted with something entirely novel and profoundly dangerous. Some, recognizing the unprecedented threat, adapted their tactics and broke off their attacks. Others, rigidly locked into their customary aggressive attack mindset, pressed forward with fatal consequences. By the time Thatch's division made their triumphant return to the USS Yorktown, they had achieved 3 confirmed Zero kills and had successfully driven off at least 5 additional enemy aircraft. More significantly, their unwavering defense had protected the vulnerable torpedo bombers for a sufficient duration, allowing their attack to unfold, even though the torpedo assault itself ultimately proved largely ineffective due to other complex tactical challenges. Within a matter of days, news of the ingenious Thatch Weave spread rapidly throughout the Pacific Fleet. Pilots who had previously felt utterly helpless and outmatched against the superior maneuverability of the Zeros now possessed a tangible, effective defensive tactic that demonstrably worked. However, the Thatch Weave represented far more than just an exceptionally clever maneuver. It fundamentally revolutionized the way American pilots conceptualized and approached fighter combat. The old, outdated doctrine had singularly emphasized individual pilot skill and the inherent performance capabilities of the aircraft. The emergent new doctrine, in stark contrast, underscored the paramount importance of seamless teamwork, rigorous tactical discipline, and the shrewd exploitation of enemy psychology. The profound realization was that one did not necessarily need to outturn a Zero if one could effectively outthink the Zero pilot. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific theater, fighter squadrons rapidly began to adopt and adapt the Thatch Weave to suit their specific operational requirements. Some innovative variations employed 4 aircraft instead of the original 2, thereby creating even more intricate and complex crossing patterns. Other squadrons fine-tuned the timing and spacing of the weave, customizing it based on whether they were flying Wildcats, P-40s, or the newly arriving formidable P-38 Lightnings. Nevertheless, the core principles of the maneuver remained inviolable and constant. Always turn towards your wingman, thereby forcing the enemy to make a critical choice between breaking off the attack or flying directly into a hail of gunfire. And, crucially, never engage in combat in the manner the enemy anticipates. The psychological ramifications for Japanese pilots were undeniably substantial. Intelligence reports, meticulously compiled from captured documents and through the interrogation of prisoners, revealed a distinct shift. By late 1942, Zero pilots had begun to approach combat engagements with a noticeable increase in caution. The era of effortless victories that had characterized early 1942 was definitively over. American formations that skillfully employed the weaving and scissoring tactics presented a novel and profound danger that transcended simple numerical odds. The previously unassailable Japanese tactical advantage, derived from their aircraft's superior maneuverability, had been effectively neutralized not through superior engineering or technological advancements, but through superior strategic and tactical thinking. While the thatch weave brilliantly resolved the critical problem of how to effectively counter a Zero once it had gained a positional advantage on an American fighter's tail, it did not entirely address a more fundamental and persistent question that continued to vex American fighter pilots. How does one proactively engage an enemy that cannot be outturned without first being placed on the defensive? The transformative answer to this pressing query emerged from an unexpected source: those pilots who had managed to survive by steadfastly refusing to engage in traditional dogfighting altogether. These astute aviators had serendipitously stumbled upon a revolutionary concept that would soon become the foundational cornerstone of American fighter doctrine for the remainder of the war: energy fighting. Major John L. Smith of Marine Fighting Squadron 223 arrived at Guadalcanal's beleaguered Henderson Field in August 1942, bringing with him a remarkably simple yet profoundly effective combat philosophy that he relentlessly instilled into every pilot under his command. Altitude is life, speed is life, turning is death. Smith, having meticulously studied the early, often grim combat reports, had arrived at a conclusion that, to traditionally minded fighter pilots, might have seemed almost cowardly. Never, under any circumstances, engage a Zero in a turning fight. Instead, his pilots were instructed to exclusively leverage the inherent advantages their aircraft truly possessed: superior diving speed and robust structural strength. The underlying physics of this new approach were remarkably straightforward and easily understood. A fully loaded Wildcat, for instance, weighed approximately $7,900, significantly more than the Zero's comparatively lighter $5,300. In level flight, at identical speeds, both aircraft would possess the same kinetic energy. However, in a dive, the heavier Wildcat accelerated at a much faster rate and could achieve significantly higher speeds before its structural limits were approached or exceeded. The Zero's lightweight construction, the very characteristic that endowed it with such exceptional turning agility, paradoxically became a critical liability during aggressive vertical maneuvers. Zero pilots who attempted overly aggressive dives risked critically overstressing their airframes, potentially leading to catastrophic failure. In stark contrast, American pilots flying robust aircraft such as Wildcats, P-40s, and particularly the incredibly rugged P-47 Thunderbolts that arrived later in the theater, could execute dives at speeds that would literally tear a Zero apart. Smith's pilots perfected and executed what soon became famously known as boom and zoom attacks. Their operational strategy involved patrolling at high altitudes, typically 20,000 ft or even higher, thereby consistently maintaining what pilots referred to as an energy advantage over any potential adversaries below. Upon spotting zeros at lower altitudes, they would initiate a rapid, high-speed dive, unleash a quick burst of gunfire at their target, and then immediately utilize their accumulated diving speed to zoom back up to their original high altitude before the Zeros could possibly react or engage. These devastating attacks were incredibly brief, often lasting only a matter of seconds. If the burst connected, the Zero was almost invariably destroyed. If the burst missed, the American pilot did not linger to assess the outcome. He promptly converted his speed back into altitude and positioned himself for another attack. The Zeros below could turn and twist with all their famed agility, but they were utterly incapable of catching an aircraft that steadfastly refused to engage them in their preferred arena of turning combat. Captain Joe Foss, who would ultimately conclude the war as one of America's most decorated aces with an astounding 26 confirmed victories, articulated the essence of the energy fighting doctrine in remarkably blunt and unequivocal terms during a debriefing in November 1942. The Zero wants you to turn. That's his game. So don't play it. Stay above him. Stay fast. Hit him when he's not looking, and get out before he can respond. It's not about being brave or proving you're a better pilot in a fair fight. It's about killing the enemy and going home alive. Foss's concise yet powerful words perfectly encapsulated the fundamental and profound mindset shift that was rapidly unfolding across the entire Pacific theater of operations. The sophisticated concept of energy management extended far deeper than merely executing dives and climbs. Pilots began to perceive their aircraft not just as machines, but as a dynamic reservoir of energy, existing in two interconnected forms: kinetic energy derived from speed and potential energy gained from altitude. Every maneuver performed by the aircraft either expended this precious energy or strategically traded one form of energy for another. A sharp, aggressive turn, for instance, would inevitably bleed off speed, converting kinetic energy into angular momentum, and through the resistance of the air into wasted heat. Conversely, a climb would trade kinetic energy for potential energy, while a dive performed the exact reverse. The overarching objective was to consistently maintain a higher total energy state than one's opponent, a condition that inherently granted the pilot control over the terms of engagement, dictating when and how to fight, or when to disengage. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, who had earlier expressed his deep frustration and lamented the inherent inadequacies of traditional dogfighting tactics against the Agile Zero, emerged as one of the most fervent and vocal advocates for the new energy fighting doctrine. By September 1942, he had meticulously developed a comprehensive training program that ingeniously utilized chalk talks and blackboard diagrams. The primary purpose of this innovative curriculum was to teach pilots how to intuitively visualize and understand critical energy states during the chaotic intensity of aerial combat. He would often illustrate with hypothetical scenarios, drawing two aircraft and posing a direct question to his trainees. This Zero is at $15,000 FT doing 180 knots. You're at 20,000 FT doing 250 knots. Who has the energy advantage? The consistent and unequivocal answer was always the aircraft possessing more total energy, and that aircraft, by virtue of its superior energy state, retained the decisive power to determine whether to engage the enemy in battle or to strategically disengage. A crucial decision for any aviator in the throes of aerial combat revolved around the stark choice: engage in a direct confrontation or disengage and retreat. This fundamental principle demanded a level of self-control that often ran counter to the inherent aggressive predispositions of a seasoned fighter pilot. For instance, if a pilot initiated a dive attack on a Japanese Zero and failed to connect, every fiber of their being would instinctively urge them to loop back and attempt another pass. They would have just descended thousands of feet at blistering velocities, their adversary still seemingly within reach, and the natural inclination would be to turn and re-engage. However, such a maneuver would invariably bleed off all their accumulated speed, instantly placing them in the same disadvantageous energy state as the Zero, slow and perilously exposed. The Zero pilot, who moments earlier had been on the defensive, could then swiftly reverse the tables, transforming into the aggressor. History unequivocally demonstrated that those pilots who succumbed to this seductive temptation often met their demise. The ingenious throttle-down overshoot technique emerged from the crucible of desperate circumstances, situations where all other conventional strategies had been exhausted or rendered ineffective. This typically occurred when a pilot had forfeited their crucial altitude advantage, or a Zero had managed to latch onto their tail despite their most valiant efforts to evade. The standard defensive weave was often not an option, perhaps because their wingman was preoccupied with their own struggle elsewhere. Conventional energy fighting doctrine explicitly stated that a pilot should never find themselves in such a precarious position. Yet, the chaotic reality of combat frequently defied theoretical constructs, and sometimes theory and reality collided in the most catastrophic manner imaginable. It was in these dire moments that innovative pilots discovered the throttle lever itself could be wielded as an unexpected weapon. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Ensign James Sweat inadvertently stumbled upon this groundbreaking technique on April 7, 1943, amidst a massive aerial assault launched by Japanese forces against Guadalcanal. A tenacious Zero had relentlessly pursued his Wildcat after Sweat had depleted his precious altitude and speed advantages during a frenetic skirmish with enemy dive bombers. Sweat was violently maneuvering his Wildcat through a series of evasive actions, but the relentless Zero pilot mirrored his every turn, steadily closing the distance between them. Sweat's aircraft was already significantly damaged, visibly losing hydraulic fluid, and he acutely understood that he had perhaps mere seconds before the adversary's formidable 20mm cannons would shred his empennage. In a moment of sheer desperation, he executed a maneuver that defied every ingrained instinct. He abruptly chopped his throttle to idle. The impact was instantaneous and profoundly dramatic. The Wildcat's sudden and severe deceleration violently flung Sweat forward against the restraint of his shoulder harness. Behind him, the Zero pilot had been meticulously tracking his target's speed, carefully adjusting his own throttle to maintain an optimal firing position. When Sweat's aircraft unexpectedly decelerated, the Zero's inherent momentum carried it forward with unstoppable force. In the lexicon of aerial combat, this phenomenon is precisely termed an overshoot. The Zero flashed past Sweat's left wing, undergoing an astonishing transformation from a menacing predator to a vulnerable prey in a matter of milliseconds. Sweat immediately slammed his throttle forward, subtly elevated his aircraft's nose, and unleashed a concentrated 2-second burst into the Zero's vulnerable underbelly as it momentarily hung exposed directly in front of him. The Japanese aircraft, critically damaged, instantly rolled inverted and plummeted irrevocably into the vast expanse of the sea. The underlying physical principles governing the throttle-down overshoot are deeply embedded in the concepts of momentum and human reaction time. An aircraft, hurtling through the air at 280 miles per hour, traverses approximately 410 feet every second. When a pursuing pilot observes their target suddenly reduce speed, a precise sequence of events unfolds. Initially, there is a recognition lag. The human brain typically requires about half a second to fully register that the target's velocity has changed. This is followed by a decision lag, an additional quarter second needed to determine the appropriate response. Finally, an action lag occurs, representing the time it takes to physically manipulate the throttle or control stick. By the time the pursuing pilot has successfully reduced power and applied the necessary back pressure to prevent an overshoot, they have already closed the distance by an additional 200 to 300 feet beyond their initial intention. However, this technique was far more nuanced and intricate than simply yanking back the throttle and hoping for a favorable outcome. Pilots who honed this method through repeated combat encounters discovered that impeccable timing and acute situational awareness were paramount. Reducing the throttle too early would allow the pursuing pilot ample time to adjust their own speed, simply slowing down in tandem and maintaining their advantageous firing position. Conversely, reducing throttle too late, especially if the enemy was already within effective firing range, would merely present an easier target. The optimal window, the sweet spot, was identified as the moment when the pursuing aircraft was approximately 2 to 3 seconds from its ideal firing position, close enough that the pilot's attention was fully engrossed in their gun sight and target tracking, rather than on broad maneuvering. The successful execution of this technique also necessitated a profound understanding of the pursuer's psychological framework. By mid-1943, Zero pilots had developed predictable attack patterns, refined over hundreds of successful engagements. Their typical approach involved closing to within 200 feet, settling into a position slightly behind and below their target, and then delivering a methodical burst aimed at the cockpit and engine. This consistent and predictable attack profile, while effective for them, paradoxically made it exploitable. A Zero pilot who had committed to this specific killing shot had locked their aircraft into a particular flight path and speed. Their expectation was that their target would either maintain speed or desperately attempt to accelerate. A sudden and dramatic deceleration was simply not an element within their established tactical playbook. Marine Captain Jefferson DeBlanc, who achieved 9 aerial victories during the arduous Guadalcanal campaign, vividly recounted teaching the throttle-down technique to newly arrived replacement pilots in early 1943. He would instruct them, "Think of it like playing chicken, but in reverse. The Zero pilot is convinced he's already won. He's settling in for the kill. That very confidence renders him predictable. When you chop throttle, you are gambling that his momentum and his ingrained expectations will carry him past you before he can possibly react. It is not a comfortable sensation. Your speed plummets, your controls become sluggish, and every instinct screams that you are making a grievous error. But if your timing is impeccable, you gain 1 or 2 precious seconds where he is directly in front of you, and crucially, you are still alive to fire. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please leave a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The throttle down maneuver, while revolutionary, possessed inherent limitations that pilots quickly discovered through the harsh realities of trial and error. It was fundamentally a one-time trick. Once executed, a pilot had largely bled off most of their airspeed and energy. If the pilot failed to capitalize on the opportunity presented by the enemy's overshoot and missed their shot, they would find themselves in a profoundly perilous situation, slow, vulnerable, and devoid of any energy reserves for further evasive action. Furthermore, this technique proved largely ineffective against multiple attackers. While it might force 1-0 to overshoot, its wingman would simply adjust their position and exploit the low-speed recovery phase to shoot down the vulnerable aircraft. The pivotal Battle of Midway in June 1942 had unequivocally validated the effectiveness of Thach's weave under intense combat conditions. However, it was the prolonged and brutal campaign for Guadalcanal that truly became the proving ground where sophisticated energy tactics and meticulous throttle management evolved from experimental concepts into established and indispensable doctrine. Henderson Field, famously captured by U.S. Marines on August 7, 1942, became the epicenter of a grueling 6-month aerial meat grinder that pilots grimly referred to as the slot. Japanese aircraft streamed down from Rabaul almost daily, and American fighters launched from Henderson's muddy, shell-pocked runway to intercept them. This was the relentless arena where theoretical principles were repeatedly, violently, and mercilessly tested against the unforgiving realities of combat. Marine Fighting Squadron 223, under the astute leadership of Major John L. Tawir. Smith arrived at Henderson on August 20th, 1942, equipped with 19 formidable Wildcats. Smith's pilots had undergone rigorous indoctrination in the core principles of energy fighting long before their deployment to Guadalcanal. Absolutely no turning with zeros. Maintain altitude, execute a dive, fire your weapons, and then climb back to altitude. On August 24th, during the tumultuous Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Smith's squadron successfully intercepted a substantial formation of Japanese bombers and their protective Zero escorts. The Marines judiciously maintained their high altitude, dove through the Zero screen at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, successfully shot down 4 bombers in their initial pass, and then swiftly zoomed back to altitude before the Zeros could mount an effective counter-response. The bewildered and surviving Zero pilots below futilely turned and twisted, demonstrating their aircraft's superior maneuverability to an empty sky, while Smith's pilots strategically positioned themselves for another devastating diving attack. The combat engagement statistics from those initial weeks at Guadalcanal painted a remarkably compelling picture. In August 1942, Marine and Navy fighters operating from the strategic Henderson Field successfully shot down 42 Japanese aircraft while incurring the loss of only 16 of their own, yielding an impressive kill ratio of approximately 2.6 to 1. In stark contrast, the fighting witnessed in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies just 6 months prior had frequently seen ratios that often favored the Japanese. The crucial difference was not attributed to superior aircraft. The Wildcats at Guadalcanal were precisely the same models that had struggled in earlier engagements. The fundamental difference lay in tactics. American pilots were no longer engaging in combat in a manner that played directly into the Zero's design advantages. Captain Marion Carl, who earned the distinction of becoming the first Marine Corps ace at Guadalcanal, provided an illustrative account of a typical engagement on September 9, 1942, which powerfully demonstrated how throttle management had become seamlessly integrated into standard combat procedures. Carl had successfully bounced a Zero from a superior altitude, executed his firing pass, and was in the process of climbing back to altitude when he observed that his speed had diminished more than he had intended. A second Zero had deftly maneuvered into a position directly behind him during his climb. Carl deliberately continued his climb for another 3 seconds, meticulously observing his airspeed indicator drop from 210 to 180 knots, intentionally allowing the pursuing Zero to close the distance. Then, with precise coordination, he simultaneously reduced his throttle to idle and deployed his landing flaps, a dual deceleration maneuver that dramatically bled off his airspeed. The Zero overshot so violently that it passed nearly 100 feet ahead of Carl's nose. Carl swiftly retracted his flaps, shoved his throttle forward, and decisively destroyed the Zero with a perfectly executed deflection shot as it desperately attempted to dive away. It is imperative to note that the Japanese naval aviators were neither unintelligent nor inflexible in their approach to aerial warfare. They quickly recognized that American tactics had undergone a significant transformation and diligently attempted to adapt their own strategies. By October 1942, Japanese fighter pilots operating over Guadalcanal began to adopt higher altitudes and engage in combat with increased caution. Some even began to incorporate slashing attacks, mirroring the American boom and zoom tactics. However, they encountered a fundamental and insurmountable problem. The Zero's inherent design was meticulously optimized for exceptional turning performance at moderate speeds. When Zero pilots attempted to engage in energy battles at high speeds and high altitudes, they inadvertently surrendered the very advantages their aircraft provided without gaining equivalent benefits in return. A Zero attempting to execute a boom and zoom maneuver was, at best, mediocre. Conversely, a Wildcat employing energy tactics was effectively leveraging its actual and inherent strengths to devastating effect. The pivotal naval engagement at Guadalcanal, occurring between November 12 and 13, 1942, served as a stark and compelling illustration of the remarkable evolution in American fighter pilot strategies within a mere 6-month span. Time S2s. During this critical confrontation, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley skillfully guided a formidable combat air patrol consisting of 8 F-4F Wildcats as a substantial Japanese aerial assault force advanced upon the American naval contingent. Rather than impulsively engaging the approaching enemy formation head-on, Flatley astutely positioned his flight division approximately 5,000 feet above the Japanese aircraft and slightly off to their flank. This calculated maneuver ensured his pilots maintained a significant advantage in both altitude and potential energy, crucial elements for controlling the flow of battle. His aviators then executed a series of relentless diving attacks against the bomber formation, with each Wildcat repeatedly performing 3 or 4 individual boom and zoom passes. The Japanese Zero escorts, despite their efforts to intervene, found themselves perpetually on the defensive, reacting to American initiatives instead of dictating the terms of engagement. Flatley's highly effective division successfully downed 7 enemy bombers and 2 Zeros, remarkably achieving this without incurring the loss of a single American aircraft. This tactical masterclass underscored a nascent but potent shift in aerial combat methodology. The dramatic improvement in kill-to-loss ratios became increasingly evident as the year 1942 drew to a close. Throughout the months of November and December, American fighter pilots operating in the Solomon Islands achieved an impressive engagement rate, neutralizing nearly 4 Japanese aircraft for every one of their own lost. Subsequent intelligence, gleaned from captured Japanese documents and the meticulous interrogation of prisoners of war, unequivocally revealed a burgeoning respect, and indeed apprehension, among the Japanese regarding the efficacy of American fighter tactics. One particular Japanese naval aviator, who was shot down and subsequently captured in December 1942, informed his interrogators that Zero pilots had received explicit directives to abstain from protracted engagements with American fighters that managed to secure and maintain an altitude advantage. He pointedly remarked that the Americans no longer fight foolishly, a testament to the profound and rapid changes occurring in the skies above the Pacific. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Henderson Field, an unassuming airstrip, inadvertently transformed into an indispensable, informal tactical laboratory where highly effective combat techniques were organically disseminated through direct peer-to-peer instruction among pilots. Seasoned veterans routinely took newly arrived aviators aside, meticulously elucidating the precise methods for executing critical maneuvers such as throttle-down overshoots, imparting crucial insights on how to accurately assess aircraft energy states and teaching them to instinctively recognize when a Zero pilot had irrevocably committed to an attack pattern. At this juncture, these innovative methods had not yet been codified into formal military doctrine. The official training manuals still being utilized back in the United States largely adhered to traditional dogfighting principles. However, in the crucible of the South Pacific, a groundbreaking new paradigm of aerial combat was being forged out of sheer necessity and meticulously refined through the harsh realities of survival. By the nascent months of 1943, both the United States Navy and Marine Corps recognized they faced a unique challenge. While undeniably a positive development, it remained a logistical and instructional hurdle. Experienced pilots operating in the Pacific Theater had independently cultivated exceptionally effective tactics to counter Japanese fighters. Yet, this invaluable knowledge resided predominantly within the personal experiences of combat veterans and was sparsely documented in scattered after-action reports. Concurrently, new pilots arriving directly from stateside training facilities were still being indoctrinated in antiquated dogfighting techniques, encouraged to engage in turning maneuvers with the enemy, and to rely heavily on individual aerial combat prowess. The imperative for the Navy was clear: to systematically institutionalize the hard-won lessons learned in the bloody skies over Guadalcanal, and to transform these battlefield innovations into a standardized and comprehensive training doctrine. The Naval Air Station at Jacksonville, Florida, rapidly emerged as the nexus of this revolutionary shift in fighter pilot instruction. In February 1943, Commander John Thach himself received orders to return from the Pacific Theater, with the express mission of fundamentally redesigning the fighter training curriculum. Thach arrived not only with an extensive trove of combat data, including invaluable gun camera footage and detailed debriefing transcripts, but also with something immeasurably more significant: the undeniable credibility of a combat commander who had personally developed and proven tactics that demonstrably worked and, critically, kept pilots alive. When Thach spoke, instructors accorded him their undivided attention. When he unequivocally stated that traditional dogfighting training was needlessly costing pilots their lives, the Navy promptly initiated a profound overhaul of its approach to teaching fighter combat. The newly conceived curriculum, implemented at Jacksonville and subsequently at other training bases, signaled a complete philosophical reorientation. Student pilots were now meticulously instructed in energy management principles even before they embarked on aerobatic maneuvers. Instructors ingeniously employed classroom physics demonstrations to vividly illustrate complex kinetic and potential energy concepts. A particularly efficacious teaching method involved rolling various balls down ramps of differing heights. Students could visually and physically observe how a ball commencing its descent from a higher elevation, possessing greater potential energy, would strike with more force and traverse a greater distance, exhibiting more kinetic energy than a ball launched from a lower point. The underlying message was elegantly simple and profoundly impactful. Altitude equates to energy, and energy ultimately equates to life. The pilot who initiated an engagement from a superior altitude inherently controlled the fight. Throttle discipline was elevated to a distinct and critical training module. Student pilots engaged in simulated combat scenarios where instructors, flying faster aircraft, would position themselves on their tail, effectively mimicking a zero attack. The trainees were then required to execute precise throttle-down maneuvers while meticulously maintaining aircraft control, timing the deceleration with uncanny accuracy to induce an overshoot from their pursuer, and then recovering with sufficient alacrity to transition from a defensive posture to an offensive one. This training was inherently nerve-wracking. The act of deliberately reducing throttle with an instructor seemingly poised to attack from behind felt counterintuitive and even suicidal, yet it meticulously built the essential muscle memory and unwavering confidence required to execute this life-saving technique under the harrowing duress of actual combat. Instructors consistently observed that students who achieved mastery in throttle management during training exhibited significantly enhanced survival rates during their initial 3 combat missions, a period historically identified as the most vulnerable for inexperienced pilots. The Fighter Tactics Manual, formally published in May 1943, meticulously codified the empirical discoveries made by Pacific veterans. This groundbreaking manual explicitly advised pilots to eschew turning engagements with Japanese fighters. It provided precise altitude and speed recommendations tailored for a diverse array of tactical situations. Furthermore, it meticulously detailed the Thach weave, complete with illustrative diagrams showcasing optimal crossing angles and timing. Most crucially, it elucidated the fundamental why behind each tactic, going beyond mere instruction on what to do, to explain the underlying physics and psychological principles that rendered these techniques so remarkably effective. This comprehensive approach represented a revolutionary departure for military doctrine, which had traditionally focused on issuing commands without extensive accompanying explanations. Training also placed a paramount emphasis on rapid recognition and decisive decision-making under intense pressure. Students were rigorously trained to instantly identify aircraft silhouettes and to assess complex tactical situations within mere seconds. Critical questions became second nature. Is that enemy aircraft above or below you? What is your relative speed? Do you possess an energy advantage? Can you disengage if the engagement unexpectedly deteriorates? These interrogatives needed to be processed automatically, faster than conscious thought. Instructors ingeniously created high-pressure scenarios during training flights, incorporating simulated emergencies, multiple attackers, and low-fuel situations, thereby compelling students to make life-or-death decisions while simultaneously managing their aircraft's energy state. The Marine Corps established a parallel and equally rigorous training pipeline at Marine Corps Air Station El Centro, nestled in California's Imperial Valley. Marine instructors, many of whom were battle-hardened veterans of Guadalcanal, infused an even more aggressive dimension into the energy fighting doctrine. They emphatically stressed that maintaining altitude discipline demanded an almost excruciating degree of patience. Newly minted pilots often harbored an instinctive desire to dive on every perceived target, thereby squandering their crucial energy advantage for a low-probability shot. Veterans painstakingly taught them the critical importance of waiting, of stalking their prey, and of positioning themselves with such unparalleled precision that the enemy remained utterly unaware of the impending attack until the impact of bullets began. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Indian Joe Bauer, a revered Medal of Honor recipient and a Guadalcanal veteran, succinctly advised his students, "The successful fighter pilot is patient, calculating, and ruthless. Gallantry is for movies. Efficiency is for survival." By the middle of 1943, every fighter pilot graduating from Navy and Marine Corps training programs had been thoroughly indoctrinated in the principles of energy tactics and throttle management. They had meticulously practiced the thatch weave until they could execute it flawlessly, even in a state of semi-consciousness. They had undergone forced overshoot drills until the act of reducing throttle in a defensive situation felt entirely natural rather than terrifyingly counterintuitive. They inherently understood that their Wildcats, Corsairs, or Hellcats could not outturn a nimble Zero, and consequently, they would never attempt to do so. This standardized and comprehensive training meant that veteran squadron commanders in the Pacific could confidently trust that replacement pilots arriving in the theater already possessed a fundamental and practical understanding of how to effectively fight and, crucially, how to survive. The subsequent combat results unequivocally validated the substantial investment in this advanced training. In the latter half of 1943, as a steady influx of fully trained pilots populated Pacific squadrons, American fighter kill ratios against Japanese aircraft soared to over 5-1 and continued their ascent. Notably, these impressive statistics were not exclusively the achievement of veteran aces. Rather, They represented the collective success of average pilots, systematically applying the robust tactics they had meticulously learned in training. The institutional knowledge that had been largely confined to the personal experiences of combat veterans in early 1943 had, by the year's end, evolved into a standard competency across the entirety of the fighter force. The throttle lever, once merely a control for speed, had been profoundly transformed into a potent tactical weapon that every American fighter pilot now knew how to expertly employ. The throttle-down overshoot technique, along with the broader energy fighting doctrine it so perfectly exemplified, represented something far more profound than simply a collection of clever aerial tactics. They powerfully demonstrated how American military culture, when suitably motivated and directed, possessed the inherent capacity to systematically analyze complex problems, adapt swiftly and effectively to enemy strengths, and develop innovative solutions at a pace far exceeding the adversary's ability to counter-adapt. The Japanese had dedicated the entirety of the 1930s to perfecting the formidable Zero and meticulously training an elite corps of naval aviators to exploit its inherent capabilities. In stark contrast, Americans, within a mere 6-month period in 1942, deciphered how to effectively neutralize a decade of Japanese investment, and then proceeded to institutionalize that invaluable knowledge across thousands of pilots. This remarkable adaptability generated a compounding advantage that extended far beyond the confines of individual dogfights, fundamentally altering the trajectory of aerial combat in the Pacific. By the concluding months of 1943, the Japanese Naval Air Arm found itself ensnared within a relentless, self-perpetuating predicament. The cream of their aerial combatants, the highly seasoned veterans whose prowess had afforded them dominance throughout the initial stages of the conflict, were tragically no more. They had been systematically eliminated, brought down by American aviators who had, through arduous experience and strategic ingenuity, mastered the art of eschewing engagement on the enemy's preferred terms. Successor pilots, hastily introduced to service, underwent drastically curtailed training regimens, a direct consequence of Japan's acute shortages in vital aviation fuel, the pressing constraints of time, and the perilous absence of secure operational airspace, essential for the comprehensive development of skilled flyers. These newly minted green pilots were compelled to operate the very same iconic A-6M Zero fighters that had instilled widespread fear across the Pacific theater in 1942. However, they now lacked the invaluable guidance and formidable leadership of their veteran predecessors. And critically, they confronted American pilots who had been meticulously indoctrinated in innovative tactical doctrines. These new strategies were expressly conceived to capitalize on the inherent vulnerabilities of the Zero, effectively turning its perceived strengths into exploitable deficiencies. It was not the aerial platform itself that had undergone a fundamental alteration. Rather, it was the caliber and experience of the individuals at the controls that had precipitously deteriorated. The profound shift in aerial superiority and pilot proficiency was vividly underscored by the calamitous event for Japan, known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, which unfolded over 2 harrowing days, June 19th and 20th in 1944. During the broader engagement of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American carrier-borne fighter squadrons, predominantly flying the formidable F-6F Hellcats, aircraft that skillfully integrated the legendary durability of the earlier F-4F Wildcat, with vastly enhanced performance characteristics, decisively intercepted colossal waves of incoming Japanese attack formations. The American aviators meticulously adhered to strict altitude discipline, expertly leveraged energy tactics to their advantage, and judiciously applied throttle management whenever the tactical situation demanded. Over this brief, brutal period, the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered the catastrophic destruction of approximately 600 aircraft, a staggering toll that crippled their air power. In stark contrast, American losses amounted to roughly 120 machines, with the majority of these unfortunate incidents attributed to operational mishaps and non-combat-related accidents, rather than direct engagement with the enemy. This resulted in an astonishing kill ratio that surpassed 10-1 in favor of the Americans. From this devastating blow, Japanese naval aviation would never truly recuperate its former strength or effectiveness. The venerable Zero fighter itself had not intrinsically reached a state of obsolescence. Rather, the sophisticated and effective tactics devised to neutralize its advantages had become widely adopted and universally applied by its adversaries. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The innovative intellectual paradigm that gave birth to the throttle-down tactics, a revolutionary approach to air combat, extended its profound influence far beyond the confines of fighter aviation, permeating various facets of American military strategy and operational thought. This identical analytical methodology, characterized by a diligent examination of an adversary's inherent strengths, a meticulous identification of the fundamental assumptions underpinning those strengths, and the subsequent development of tactical maneuvers explicitly designed to nullify or invalidate those very assumptions, manifested itself across a multitude of military domains. For instance, submarine commanders meticulously scrutinized the intricacies of Japanese anti-submarine warfare doctrine, subsequently devising ingenious tactics engineered to exploit its discernible weaknesses and operational lacunae. Concurrently, bomber formations undertook comprehensive analyses of enemy fighter attack patterns, leading to significant modifications and enhancements in their defensive configurations and operational procedures, thereby bolstering their resilience against aerial assaults. In essence, the entire military establishment transformed into a dynamic, adaptive learning organization. It began to perceive enemy capabilities not as immutable, insurmountable obstacles, but rather as intricate problems, amenable to resolution through rigorous, systematic analysis and continuous tactical innovation. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of this entire tactical evolution was how the innovative throttle technique vividly demonstrated that military conflict often bestows its greatest rewards upon those who possess the temerity to question established assumptions and boldly challenge entrenched conventional wisdom. Orthodox fighter aviation doctrine had long dictated that aerial combat was primarily a contest of turning and maneuvering, emphasizing agility and dogfighting prowess. Every ingrained human instinct, particularly when under duress, screamed that when an adversary was relentlessly pursuing you, the only logical response was to accelerate, to increase speed, never to decelerate. Thus, the very notion of intentionally reducing one's airspeed when an enemy aircraft was locked onto your tail seemed utterly preposterous, bordering on suicidal. Yet it was precisely this insane idea that proved revolutionary, adopted by pilots who were either desperate enough to cast aside convention or creative enough to envision a new possibility. These individuals discovered, through trial and error, that sometimes a radical departure from the norm yielded far superior results than adherence to conventional, albeit sane, approaches. Illustrative examples abound. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, using humble matchsticks on his desk, meticulously worked out the Thatch weave. Major Marion Carl, in a moment of critical decision, decisively chopped his throttle with a menacing zero close behind him. And Colonel John Smith, who rigorously drilled his squadron pilots on the counterintuitive instruction to never turn when under attack. These were not merely isolated acts of martial genius, born from innate skill alone. Rather, they represented profound acts of intellectual courage, a fearless willingness to experiment with radically different strategies and tactics when the prevailing conventional methods were consistently resulting in devastating losses and countless casualties. The Japanese, regrettably for their war effort, conspicuously failed to cultivate an equivalent capacity for such fundamental adaptive innovation throughout the entirety of the Pacific War. Remarkably, the iconic A6M0 fighter itself underwent negligible modifications or substantive enhancements from 1942 right through to 1945. This occurred even as the continually evolving and increasingly sophisticated American tactics systematically rendered its once formidable advantages progressively inconsequential. Simultaneously, Japanese aviation training doctrine rigidly maintained its unwavering emphasis on cultivating individual pilot skill and fostering aggressive engagement strategies. This steadfast adherence persisted even in the face of a precipitous and catastrophic decline in the overall quality and experience level of their aviators, a decline that fundamentally undermined the very tenets of their combat philosophy. A crucial differentiator emerged in the dissemination of critical combat knowledge when American pilots successfully assimilated and mastered the principles of throttle discipline and energy management. This invaluable tactical understanding was then systematically shared and integrated across their entire operational structure. This ensured a widespread adoption of effective methodologies. Conversely, while it is acknowledged that some Japanese pilots did indeed develop isolated techniques to effectively counter the burgeoning American tactics, such invaluable insights and innovations very seldom propagated beyond the confines of their immediate individual units. This severe limitation in knowledge transfer meant that the broader Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service could not benefit from these hard-won lessons. The very organizational culture that had initially fostered the Zero's unparalleled excellence and its early war dominance ultimately proved incapable of adapting and evolving when that initial inherent excellence was no longer sufficient to secure victory against a rapidly learning and innovating adversary. This profound tactical evolution, which would fundamentally redefine air-to-air combat, originated from the most primal and desperate of human motivations, pilots striving with every fiber of their being simply to survive. The intense and often brutal engagements against the formidable Zero fighters in the early stages of the Pacific War forged enduring patterns and principles that would subsequently delineate and shape American air combat doctrine, not only throughout the remainder of World War II, but also extending well into the nascent jet age, and indeed far beyond. The enduring legacy of these World War II innovations was strikingly evident in subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War, for instance, pilots at the controls of F-86 Sabres, engaging the formidable MiG-15s, instinctively employed sophisticated energy tactics and judicious throttle management, principles directly inherited and refined from the hard-won experiences of the preceding global conflict. Tragically, a generation of Vietnam-era fighter pilots, having inadvertently allowed these crucial lessons to fade from collective memory, found themselves attempting to engage in close-quarters turn fighting against agile MiG-17s, while piloting their significantly heavier and less maneuverable F-4 Phantoms. This costly oversight led to a painful and often deadly process of relearning these fundamental truths. The stark realities of combat losses eventually spurred the establishment of groundbreaking institutions like Top Gun and other advanced fighter training programs, which were specifically designed to vigorously re-emphasize the core energy fighting principles first developed in the skies above Guadalcanal. Even today, contemporary fighter pilots continue to receive comprehensive instruction on critical concepts such as energy states, the intricate mechanics of overshoots, and the paramount importance of meticulously controlling engagement geometry. These fundamental principles, forming the bedrock of modern aerial combat, would be instantly and profoundly recognizable to pioneering aviators like Jimmy Thach or Marion Carl, testament to their timeless efficacy. In a broader metaphorical sense, the humble throttle lever itself transcended its purely mechanical function to become a potent symbol of this profound and far-reaching transformation in aerial warfare. It had always been an omnipresent fixture within the cockpit, a seemingly rudimentary mechanical control manipulated by every pilot countless times during the course of a single flight, adjusting engine power and speed. Yet, remarkably, for an extended period, no one had conceived of it as an offensive or defensive weapon, an instrument of tactical advantage, until the dire and unforgiving exigencies of combat fundamentally compelled a surge of unprecedented creativity and unconventional thinking. This entire historical narrative distills down to a singularly essential and enduring lesson. Frequently, the very instruments or resources required to effectively resolve complex challenges are already readily at hand, existing within our grasp. What is truly indispensable, however, is the imaginative vision to perceive familiar objects or concepts in entirely novel and unconventional ways, the unwavering courage to embark upon approaches that defy established norms, and the rigorous discipline to systematically codify and disseminate that which proves genuinely effective. The American fighter pilots of 1942 did not idly await the arrival of superior aircraft platforms to overcome the formidable Zero. Instead, with remarkable ingenuity, they fully utilized the aircraft. They possessed, harnessed the immutable principles of physics that govern all aerial flight, and tapped into the extraordinary wellspring of creativity that often emerges under the intense pressure of desperation. They made the audacious choice to pull the throttle back, deliberately reducing speed at moments when every ingrained instinct and conventional wisdom dictated precisely the opposite to push it forward. And in executing this seemingly counterintuitive maneuver, they profoundly altered the dynamics of air combat. They transformed the hunters into the hunted, effectively rendering Japan's most celebrated aerial weapon into an anachronistic relic. More significantly, they conclusively demonstrated that dynamic adaptation ultimately triumphs over static perfection, particularly when that perfection proves incapable of evolving. The Zero pilots, who with unwavering confidence committed to their pursuits, fully anticipating yet another effortless victory, instead found themselves catastrophically overshooting their intended targets, suddenly exposed and utterly vulnerable in what would tragically be the final, fleeting seconds of their lives. In that decisive moment, the throttle had indeed delivered its verdict, forever altering the course of aerial warfare.